guys, Austin here again at True Automotive. We're back on this 2018 Tundra. Today we are going to be focusing on performance. Now I have this Harrop Supercharger kit here in front of us. Today we're going to be focusing on that. This is the Stage 2 kit. So this is going to come with larger injectors, a larger fuel pump, as well as some tuning software. This has an air-to-water intercooler setup. The Stage 2 is going to come with a little bit different injector setup, as well as a 80mm pulley versus the factory 85. The factory 85 pulley is good for 6.5 pounds of boost. The 80mm is good for 8.5 pounds of boost. This kit has tremendous results on the Tundra platform on the 5.7, and we generally see around 100 extra horse at the wheel and about 80 extra foot-pounds at the wheel as well. Stay tuned, and we'll be working on this install. All right, so we're going to start with removing our grill. There are 4 screws on the top, 2 side clips. Then it pulls straight out. There is a lane assist sensor here that we just disconnect. The next thing that we're going to do is the latch. We're also going to remove the horn. All right, so there are the 2 front 10mm here. There's a 10mm back here. There is also a hood latch sensor. There's going to be a clip on the back that we're going to unclip. I just unbolt it from the subframe down here and this front crossbar. Horns. I like to unplug these guys and set them to the side just so we have some more working area. This is where the air-to-water heat exchanger is going to be going. All right, so now that we've gotten the horns off, we've gotten the hood latch out of here. Next, we're going to be focusing on the AC condenser brackets, which is retained with basically 4 10s on each side. So we're going to go ahead and remove those. All right, so as we're unbolting this as well, you'll notice your AC condenser is getting loose. We just want to be very careful that we're not losing any hardware. We're kind of knowing where things are going. On this side, you will want to come in and unbolt it with your 3 10s. Here, there's a little tricky one. See how loose that guy's getting now? Just be cognizant of where your hardware is going. Guys, now that we kind of have our heat exchanger kind of lightly put in here, kind of want to highlight a couple of tips or things that we kind of ran into. First of all, make sure that your horn wiring harness does not get pinched between your AC condenser and your heat exchanger for your intercooler. The next thing is just kind of bolting everything up lightly versus tightening it as you go. So kind of we have everything light right now. We're going to go ahead and snug them up. And then we're going to move on to trimming these outer plastic pieces for all the hoses. All right, guys, now that we kind of have our heat exchanger kind of lightly put in here, kind of want to highlight a couple of tips or things that we kind of ran into. First of all, make sure that your horn wiring harness does not get pinched between your AC condenser and your heat exchanger for your intercooler. The next thing is just kind of bolting everything up lightly versus tightening it as you go. So kind of we have everything light right now. We're going to go ahead and snug them up, and then we're going to move on to trimming these outer plastic pieces for all the hoses. All right, next up we're going to be going ahead and trimming the right-hand side of the basically cowl panel. You know, the intercooler hoses are more than likely to be wrapped through here, as well as the pump. You can see kind of your in and out here. So we'll go ahead and get this guy popped off. This has some little clips. I like to just come in here with a real small screwdriver and kind of work my way around it. There are some tools out there, but these clips are sensitive, so I just kind of take my time with them. Also on this like cowl piece right here in the video, they do say right hand side. Just for clarity, this is going to be the passenger side of the vehicle. And I think the easiest way to identify it when you're doing the install is going to be your ins and outs for the intercooler itself are on that same side. Alright guys, I have the passenger side cowl out of the vehicle. I've got basically what I'm going to be cutting, templated it out. This is basically going to allow access for the hoses and the pump for the heat exchanger for the intercooler. We're going to go ahead and get this cut out with a little air saw. Keep moving on. Alright, so now that we've got the original the cowl cut, we're going to go ahead and put it back in. We're going to be using the original clips. These clips are very sensitive, so just kind of take your time. All right, next up we have the air-to-water, basically water pump. This little bracket is really kind of a trick. Two supplied button head bolts that come with the kit go into a threaded, so a factory threaded piece on the front core support. Alright, next up on our install of the supercharger is going to be the heat exchanger pump. This is essentially like an electric water pump. We are going to want this port to be pointing straight up, and we're going to be attaching it to our bracket that we previously bolted in down here. Alright, so the next kind of step in our process here is going to be essentially giving power to our water pump for our heat exchanger. So a couple of things. It's going to involve the fuse tap, and we'll go over that. But it's also going to require you wiring the wires all the way up into here. In their instructions, they suggest going ahead and drilling a hole in the side of your fuse panel to ensure that you're not going too deep, but ensuring you can still access this. We did mock this on here prior to pulling the battery. In our instructions, it doesn't say anything about pulling the battery. We just did it because we felt like it was going to be a little bit cleaner of a look and a little easier for us to kind of get in there. So kind of our next step is going to be routing our wiring. I think our mindset is actually going to be following the factory wiring harness from this side, so up underneath our front cowl here. Hopefully we get it tucked nicely for you and get her wired up. Now we have basically our electrical connection for our pump going in there. It's going to come all the way up in here, and it is going to fuse tap off of an ignition source. So that's basically giving our relay an ignition source. Gives you kind of detailed instructions in there, but basically it's a fuse tap, 10 amp. And then from there, on the back of our relay, we're going to have a negative and positive. These should be hooked directly to battery. So we're going to go ahead and get the battery thrown back in here and get these hooked up to the positive and negative, and then we can kind of move on to the next step. Alright, moving along on the supercharger install, now we're going to be working on the manifold side of things. So we're going to start off by essentially removing the manifold. That's going to allow us to be able to put the supercharger on, as well as do injectors and a couple other supporting mods. We'll start off by removing the engine cover, pretty simple. Then we're basically going to be going through and focusing on electrical connections. And what I mean by that is basically, you know, like your coolant temperature sensor, your throttle body, that type of stuff. next step is going to be, as we're kind of working and removing this intake manifold, is actually going to be removing this coolant bypass hose. So it's basically like a metal hose in here. Something they don't mention in the instructions is it's definitely a good idea to drain the coolant out of the car first, as you don't want to make a massive mess. So right now we've got it draining. We're using the petcock on the bottom of the radiator, and we're going to start going ahead and disassembling. All right, so as we have our coolant draining right now our attention's going to go towards kind of getting this stock intake manifold off of the vehicle while it's draining. You'll notice there's these foam pieces in here. We will pull these out. So we're working on basically the wiring loom on the back side of the intake manifold. This does have to be removed before the manifold can come off. They got little click tabs to them, so you kind of have to carefully pry them without breaking the tab. One on each side too, I'm sure of that. All right, now that we've kind of gotten those back electrical connectors, which honestly aren't terribly fun to get popped off, but we were able to do it. We have a bunch of 12mm bolts holding the intake manifold on. One of the biggest things to kind of keep in mind when we're doing this is just ensuring that we're not dropping any sort of debris down into, essentially the intake manifold ports when we go to pull it off. So now that we have the stock intake manifold off, like I was saying before, it's extremely important not to drop anything down into these intake runners. If you do, it's going to go right into the cylinder head. Could cause catastrophic failure. One thing you will notice is we have a pretty cool little bird's nest in the top of ours. We're going to go ahead and tape these off, and then we're going to go ahead and clean that bird's nest out. So now manifold's off, we've kind of gotten some debris cleaned out of there. Now we're going to be working on the coolant crossover pipe. Essentially there's going to be an idler pulley on the new coolant crossover pipe that provides the supercharger with basically a belt. So we've got lots of little hoses to disconnect. We just need to kind of focus on being detailed, not tearing any hoses, and being nice with the clamps. All right, so now that we've kind of been working on this crossover pipe, we've gotten basically all of the hoses disconnected. This does, it does have a clamp that's kind of on the 100% 180 side of things. So what you're gonna do is we're gonna leave this one hooked up and just pull this off and then get it from the bottom side. Or if we can't figure that out, we can always disconnect it here and then take this hose off after the fact. All right, this is the clamp that was on the bottom side. It's kind of 180 down. We will probably end up taking it off on that side because you always want to ensure that your clamp is in the exact same spot as it was when you took it off. Just like that. That's our coolant bypass hose coming off. All right, so next up we are going to go ahead and get our factory belt off. There is a tensioner down here, down below, with a 14mm on it, and we're going to turn this counterclockwise. Go ahead and release the belt tension. And then from there, we're gonna go ahead and get our belt completely removed and out of the way. All right, next up on our agenda here is going to be working on the oil cooler lines. Basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be disconnecting the oil cooler lines at the end of the soft line, and then we're going to be removing the entire hardline assembly. The hardline assembly ends near the driver front wheel well. We'll be removing a couple of pieces off the AC compressor as well. There's a little bit of fishing involved here, but we're just take our time and get through it. As we're kind of moving forward again, we are working on these oil cooler hoses. Basically, the oil cooler hoses go right behind the AC condenser. The AC condenser is retained with 4 bolts. What we're actually going to do is we're going to pull the AC condenser out about 1 inch, and that is going to give us enough room to pull these oil cooler lines out. So there's basically 2 10mm bolts that retain the oil cooler lines to the engine block, and that's going to go basically behind the serpentine belt, so all of your accessories are in front of it. Well, they definitely designed and assembled this prior to having the accessories on. So this 10mm bolt is really the main reason why you have to pull the AC compressor out a little bit. But it's a little bit of a pain because it's hard to get your hand in there. And it's hard to get, only a wrench will fit in there. It's a bit slow going. Alright, so these are our oil cooler lines. These basically supply coolant to an oil cooler. These guys are now out, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Alright, so we are still kind of tinkering on this coolant bypass hose. There are some hoses that you're going to use that come with the kit, and some of them that you're going to reuse from the original stuff. Including the original gaskets you're going to reuse. You're going to reuse the original temperature sensor, which you can see is loose on here right now. We're going to go ahead and tighten that guy up. So kind of just lots of little hoses, things like that. You just kind of have to watch out for them. Another quick tip too is anytime I'm using these spring style clamps, I always ensure that they sit exactly where they came off. So whatever degree they're at, that's very important. You also always want to make sure that your hose goes all the way on the entire barb. So we're going to go ahead and get her back together. Alright, we've got the crossover pipe tight. Go ahead and get our tip sensor tight. There is a copper washer that essentially is what makes it seal. You do reuse the original. Should be good. Now we need to go through and get all of these little spring clamps. So I kind of just do a mental checklist of everything. We've got our full retaining bolts tight. We have our EGR cooler hoses. This hose is going to in turn go to our throttle body. This hose, it tells you in the instructions to route around. And then this is also going to be an oil cooler hose. So we're going to ready to move on to the next step, I believe. Alright, so next up is going to be the idler pulley for the supercharger belt. So we're actually going to remove 3 factory bolts, one 12mm, 2 14mm bolts. Then we can get that guy installed. Next on this install, since this is a stage 2 kit, we will be addressing fuel system. And what I mean by that is there will be a different set of injectors, a different regulator, and a different fuel pump. We're going to go ahead and start with the injectors here. We have to be very careful with removing fuel lines and just kind of taking our time, ensuring that we're not going to damage anything on the way out. These little fuel lines have a little plastic clip that you pull up. You kind of feel them get all the way to the top. And then a specialty pair of pliers is very helpful. And basically what we have to do is come in here and squeeze it, and then the line will pop off. Also, previously I had taken, there is an injector connector per bank. I've already taken that off, and I believe that we should be able to take it off from here. There's one rail. And our next rail. It's kind of cool that Toyota makes the whole harness kind of part of one piece of it. A little less traditional, but kind of cool, kind of nice. All right, so we're kind of working our injectors one by one. There's a connector for each one. These Toyota connectors are really susceptible to breaking, so you must be very careful when you're doing that. Also, something you'll notice is when we pull them out, a couple of these O-rings have fallen off. It looks like we had one fall off, and it looks like we had 2 still left in the lower intake manifold. So we'll just want to make sure that that we pull these out of the old manifold, that we have a clean mating surface, and that we lubricate our new injectors. And what I'm talking about on the clip side is when you push this down, they really don't like to pop back up. So people tend to start yanking on it, getting a little crazy. What I actually like to do is come in with just a little pick and just give it a little hand. And then it'll just slide up like that. And then your injector should just slide down. Just like that. Alright, so now we have all of our injectors out of our rail. Our new injectors look very, very similar. Obviously they're just a little dirtier or a little cleaner. They do come with some lubrication, which is highly, highly recommended that you use it. You don't want a leaking injector. You just need to make sure that you kind of coat the O-ring itself on both the base and going into the rail on each injector. And then they just kind of slide in conjunction with getting your connector in at the same time. So we should be able to get our connector started. And then go right there. And then you should hear each one of these guys click in. Feels good. We just kind of work our way down the line. All right, so kind of going through these injectors, a couple things that I'm looking at is, wow, it's important for us to ensure that we don't separate we separate these correctly because they look identical. In fact, they have the same amount of nozzles, which to my count is 10 nozzle, which is kind of the amount of holes in the tip itself. The only thing I can visually tell is we have a different color tip on it and a different part number on it. So I'm sure that these have a higher flow rate, and I'm sure that's kind of goes in conjunction with the different fuel pump and regulator. On this particular kit too, if your truck does have flex fuel, you do not need to change the fuel pump. Flex fuel generally demands more fuel to be able to run something like an E85. Right, so we're just going to carefully kind of drop our rails in, making sure that all the injectors are in the hole, and then once again ensuring that we did not have any debris in there and that all the old O-rings are out. Dealing with debris in this area is one of the more difficult things for sure. We can go ahead and come in, reconnect our injector harness, which is back here. Go ahead and connect our fuel line here. This is just the crossover fuel line. Snaps in, clip or clip down. Bam. Looking good. We're going to go ahead and grab our next injector rail. Make sure these little dowels are set correctly. Just like that. So, new regulator. Once again, I think it looks extremely similar. But we're going to want to do the same thing that we did with our injectors, which is we're going to lubricate this O-ring. And that just ensures, first of all, that it slides on correctly and that it gets a nice seal. Also, on new fuel lines and stuff like that, I actually like to use that on the actual fitting too. This is actually where it clamps, so when it clicks in, that's where it hits. Let's go ahead and get this guy removed. Just like that. If anything, it looks smaller. Pop that guy on, you can definitely tell it's a lot more firm than the old one. The old one kind of has pattern built into it. And we're also going to swap our vacuum line over to that. And on to our next step. Alright, so after we've removed the tape off the intake, the lower intake manifold, we're just going to kind of lightly come in with a little bit of brake clean on a towel. And just make sure our mating surface is nice and clean, but also making sure we're not dropping anything inside these runners at all. After we think they're clean, we'll flip the supercharger over and just make sure our O-rings are still in good shape on the bottom. And then we're pretty much ready to throw that guy on here and go from there. All right, so these are the bottom runner gaskets. You can see they're really nicely molded in. You can see they protrude out a little bit, but these can pop out. So it's just very, important we watch that. We will be changing the pulley out after we put this guy on here, but sometimes it's good to have a friend help you. I think we're going to try to go ahead and manhandle this thing on here though. Alright guys, now that we kind of have the supercharger back on here, I had a little bit of a tough time with one person just getting it perfectly lined up with the studs. I actually ended up removing one of the studs up here that hold the intake manifold on, just to ensure I had like enough wiggle room. But once we kind of pulled that out and it just dropped flat on there, got a nice like rewarding thunk sound. So now we just kind of have to tidy everything else up and go through it. Now that we've got the supercharger essentially on the top of the engine, we need to go ahead and tighten down the new hardware for the supercharger. The factory torque spec for the intake manifold is 15 foot-pounds. So we're going to go ahead and snug these down, and then we're going to torque them to 15 foot-pounds. Alright, now that we've kind of gotten everything snugged up, and I mean very loosely snugged up, we're going to go ahead and take our torque wrench. There's not a specific pattern that they tell you to do this in, but I think a good reference would be like maybe a cross pattern, just to ensure it's sitting flat on the manifold. Alright, now that we've got the supercharger torqued down, we're going to go ahead and change out this pulley from the 85 to the provided 80 millimeter with the stage 2 kit. Alright, so next up is going to be our serpentine belt. They do provide you with a diagram. Pretty straightforward, but it is pretty tight quarters, so it might be a little tricky. Alright, so there is a 14 mil down there that has the auto tensioner for the belt. Basically, you're going to turn that counterclockwise, route your belt, and then just ensure that all of your ribs are seated correctly on every one of the pulleys. Looks like we're good to go, and we'll move on to the next step. Alright, next up we're going to be reinstalling our factory throttle body. The orientation of the throttle body is going to be in a different position. The connector end is actually going to be pointing straight up. Another thing to take note is not to be touching the throttle blade at all. Since this is a drive-by-wire system, you can affect the calibration of this. The other item to be important of too is that these bolts need to be torqued to 10 to 12 Newton meters. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and reconnect our throttle body heater hoses. This line is going to be the OEM one that came with the truck. The one from lower in the valley is going to be provided in the kit. We will be reusing the factory clamps. Alright, so next up we're going to be plumbing our intercooler setup, so the heat exchanger in the front. This is our supplied reservoir for the coolant. There are a couple 10 millimeter bolts on the supercharger itself. Alright, so we're kind of working through this plumbing. You'll notice there is a in and an out that is going to be going on our coolant reservoir. And you'll also notice there is this Y with a connector on it. Both this and the lower part of our reservoir are going to be going to our pump and heat exchanger in the front. We will be using the supplied clamps. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and plumb this up to our pump and heat exchanger. A quick little tip would be to take just a little bit of dielectric grease. These are really, really tight to get on. Just take a little tiny bit of dielectric grease and put it on the nipple so that it'll slide on considerably easier. Continuing on the supercharger install, we now have all of our intercooler, air-to-water coolant lines reconnected. We also have our oil cooler lines reconnected. So kind of everything kind of roughly set together. What I'm going to do is get everything connected, and then I'll come back through and kind of tidy it up with some zip ties and some things like that, just to kind of clean it up a little bit. But we are getting very close. So as we're kind of proceeding on, we're going to be working on the electrical side of things. Since we did rotate our throttle body up, there is a throttle body wiring sensor or a harness that's extended. So plug that guy in. The next thing, if we come over here, we have a mass airflow sensor. So this actually has a pre-out, so it kind of splices the harness. So we'll plug that in here, and then we plug it up in here into the supercharger itself. And this will end up going right back to our intake as well. All right, so now that we kind of have a bunch of this top end stuff figured out, all of our plumbing is good to go, we're gonna go ahead and top our coolant system off. We kind of opted to use brand new coolant. And then after we put some coolant in here, we're gonna move back to the fuel pump and get a new fuel pump put in this guy. Now that we're wrapping up, we're going to go ahead and get the whole front back together. That sort of just includes getting our hood latch back in, getting our horns back on, and then getting the grille put back on as well. So next in our process here at the supercharger is going to be the upgraded fuel pump. So we will need to go ahead and disconnect all of the upper lines, including the fuel lines and the electrical lines, and remove the tank, and then pull the pump out and install a new pump in the assembly. Let's get after it. This fuel tank to go ahead and get the sending unit pulled out so that we can swap our pumps around. Basically there's a big locking ring that retains the pump in there. We just got to get that guy off. Alright, this is what we would call the fuel pump assembly. This consists of the fuel pump, which is going to be inside of here, as well as our sending unit. And this is basically telling, you know, your inside gauge what your fuel level is looking like. So we need to separate these two halves. Yeah, so I'm just trying to be really careful in prying these tabs because we basically just need to get the fuel pump out of the plastic assembly. But, you know, these are very fragile, so we have to be careful. Boom. So this is actually your fuel filter. So it's good to have like a good clean area that we're doing this in. And that is the actual fuel pump. Now, if you do have a flex fuel vehicle, you do not have to replace the fuel pump. Basically, we just need to ensure we're swapping everything over correctly the way that this one was. There's an O-ring inside of here. We'll make sure that doesn't drop down. Alright, so we're dropping this in. We want to make sure that we don't catch the float. The float's what tells our fuel level inside. If it gets caught, bit, anything like that, we're going to be in big trouble. You'll notice that there's also a tange right here that has to be lined up. This is spring loaded, so basically want to hold it down. Get your locking ring. Make sure your locking ring is really square. up on this supercharger. We have a couple small things left. We did get our new fuel pump put in there. Right now, all we really need to do is, first of all, install our new programmer before we try to start the truck up. I have re-topped off the coolant system, but we still need to ensure that's bled, as well as bleeding the coolant reservoir for the heat exchanger. So we're gonna go ahead and get this installed, and then we're gonna fire this guy up. All right, so we have gone ahead and plugged our OBD2 port in. So this is gonna be a little, basically a little flasher. So it's gonna essentially put a new map on the vehicle for us. It comes with just kind of some really quick stuff. Installation says plug OBD2 port in. Essentially, then we're gonna load a file. We're gonna save our stock and then load a file. We're back on this 2018 Tundra that we installed the Stage 2 Harrop Supercharger on. We recently got the vehicle tuned and it is now running correct with the larger injectors. And this is the Stage 2 with the smaller pulley. Some of the other things that we can highlight on that we did was the power brake, big brake upgrade kit in the front. It's a 6-pod with a 2-piece rotor. We also did suspension, wheels, and tires. And what a clean package this one came out to be.